All right, so as is my practice, I'm not going to introduce David Farber, but simply tell him how happy we are to be hosting him for this seminar, really the final event of the current or the past academic year. David, are you in fact speaking to us from Kansas?
No, I'm in North Carolina right now, way up
You're
in
in
the
North
mountains of
Carolina.
Appalachia.
Okay, so you've gone to the other side,
Yeah.
apropos of our conversation. All right, so that's enough about me. Why don't you start?
Sure. Well,
Great.
first of all, thanks for having me. It's great to talk crack with y'all. It seems quite strange to be doing it. As I say, I'm up in the mountains looking out at greenery, and there's nothing urban or gritty about where I am right now, but my story is a very urban and gritty one. So, as some of you know, I've been a professor of history for a very long time, and I've written about interrelated subjects having mostly to do with political culture, but also the history of capitalism. And I've sort of had four major questions that have girded my work over these last decades, all of which I think appear in this book about the crack epidemic in the United States in the 1980s and 1990s. As I hope the introduction to the book indicates, I've always been fascinated by how Americans think about equality, what that term means, how it's deployed, and of course, the realities of the meanings of equality in people's lived experience. Related to that, I've also been fascinated by how Americans actually practice democracy, how they make their voices heard in the political system, how people relate to the state and questions of governance. And I think some of that comes out clearly in the more punitive aspects of this book about what was done to people involved in the crack market in the United States. And thirdly, and most obviously, I've been fascinated by the ways in which Americans make sense of capitalism as a system that essentially constructs most of the lived experience of so many Americans. Who benefits, who doesn't, how prosperity has wended its way through American society, and what Americans make of the inequalities that our system features as a form through which people try to make livelihoods. That obviously is at the heart of this crack cocaine project. And then fourthly, and perhaps less focused in this particular project, is America's role in the world and how Americans have competed and debated and questioned what America's role should be and how America should be interrelated with other nations around the world and with the basic human experience globally. Crack obviously is an international product. It depends on a supply chain that's transnational. So in that sense, this book also incorporates some of those questions, so that I'm sort of working the interstices then of questions of equality, democracy, capitalism, and US's role in the world in all of my work, and in particular in this book. So that's kind of my background, and I've written lots of books that try to explore those different topics. So crack is something maybe we're all familiar with, but just to make sure, you're staring at a slide. I hope everyone can see this slide. That's crack. And for those, let's see, why is this not working? Yeah. And again, just in case your day job doesn't work out, this is how you make crack. Kind of a funny story. I had a much longer and more carefully articulated recipe for the making of crack in the front of my book, and the lawyers at Cambridge University Press beseeched me not to include that recipe in the book, that we would be liable if people actually tried to make it. And so this recipe was removed. But as you can see, crack is easy to make, but it is something that you make. There's a technology involved in the making of it. So crack is really just a product made out of raw cocaine powder, and pretty much anyone can do it, but it does take a knack, and it allows people to, as capitalists would say, provide value added to the original product. So basically, that's all you need to do to make crack. You need to find some powder cocaine and then cook it up. This generally, again, just to remind you, is how crack is sold. So it's sold in these small vials. I don't have, that vial is about, to say as an American, 1.5 inches, 2 inches long. And there's 3 to 5 rocks usually in each vial. And you could buy one of those vials in the streets of New York when I lived there in the late 80s and early 90s. And they sold it about 100 yards from where I lived for $5, which even then was very cheap. So again, just to remind you, that's the drug. That's what we're talking about. It is a form of powder cocaine that's cooked up and then sold very cheaply in these vials. So, you read the introduction, I hope, please. And based on that, you should have a pretty good sense for the basic themes and arguments I was trying to make in the book. But from my perspective, these are sort of the 4 major points I was trying to raise in the book. And I was really trying, above all else, to think about crack, cocaine as a business, as a part of the predatory capitalist regime that really takes off in the 1980s. I was trying to ground the experience of a transformative and transitional economy in the lives of poor people, and especially poor African Americans, who were watching the economy that they thought they were going to inherit sort of vaporize right underneath them. And watching poor African American men in particular try to find their way, try to find their path to prosperity in the midst of a very debilitating economic set of dislocations that were occurring during this time. I also saw this study of crack cocaine as a way to kind of think through about the ways in which so many Americans, especially in the margins, going all the way back to the 18th century, have always found in some ways a deviant form of capitalism to give themselves the main chance. I can't resist saying in a talk in Israel, as a reminder, the ways in which Jews in the United States were so fundamentally important to the alcohol prohibition years. And before that, to the illegal drug industry. Jews and Italians basically dominated both of those industries in the United States in the first third of the 20th century. So the ways in which marginal people locked out of capitalism through anti-Semitism, through racism, through ethnic hierarchies, always find a way to transpose the economy of their times into the opportunities that are available to them. Struck me as a kind of untold or under-narrated aspect of the American experience. And I've really tried in a lot of my work to explore how capitalism as a lived experience plays out quite differently depending upon the circumstances of oneself through the traditional hierarchies of American life, through gender, through race, through religion, through class position. And so to some extent, this book, above all else, is a story about entrepreneurial capitalism from the bottom up. And then what the rest of the United States does about it. And I was particularly fascinated by the ways in which people within the African American community wrestled with the complexities of the economic viability of what was a very destructive drug market in their own communities. So I spent a good deal of time watching African Americans kind of wrestle over the viability of underground economics in their own neighborhoods and communities. I also do the obvious in this book, which is to explain to some extent the ways in which mainstream elites punish those who embrace this underground economy to make sense of their economic predicaments in the 1980s and 1990s. So, it's not a story original to me, but I do track the incredible increase in incarceration that is associated with this entrepreneurial activity of selling an illegal drug in the United States, and the immense punitive power of the state that's put in place to take down this destructive economic set of relationships that ensues out of the crack cocaine marketplace. In particular, I try to do something different that I think maybe for Americanists in the room, and for the others who study sort of the growth and development of carceral states all over the world, is that in the United States, because of the federalist system which we operate within, most historians, most scholars, most people who have become kind of the leading voices on carceral state studies in the United States, have focused on the federal government's response. And I do too. Everybody, I think maybe who's in this seminar knows the story of how the 1986 Drug Abuse Act created this 100-to-1 ratio in punishing people who sold crack cocaine, overwhelmingly African American, and those who sold powder cocaine in the United States, overwhelmingly white and Hispanic. So if you sold crack, you could face far fiercer punishment than if you sold powder cocaine. But only about 8 to 10% of people who are incarcerated for selling drugs do so under federal law. 90% are sentenced under state and local law. So one of the things I do in the book is try to figure out, is the kind of new Jim Crow argument about the carceral state in which you get federal actors punishing Black people in order to maintain racial hierarchy true if you look at places like Black-run cities like Washington, D.C., or somewhat Black-controlled cities like Chicago during this time, or contested places like Los Angeles. So I was really interested in the ways in which the punitive nature of the drug regimes of the United States play out locally. And there, I think something we can talk about in seminar, there's a more complicated process at work than perhaps, I don't know, the abstracted notion that the United States is built around a racial hierarchy in which punishment is fiercely racist in a very straightforward way. It's harder when you look at the local and state regimes to see that. Nonetheless, my study is another chapter, as I say in the book, of the dark side of racism in the United States. The ways in which African Americans become major players in the drug markets, the ways in which they're punished, the ways in which they try to resist is just, alas, one more story of how racial hierarchies do operate in the United States. In order to understand this book, and again, to point out what I hope is pretty obvious, I do try to track back the ways in which Americas create a kind of drug regime. And as I was mentioned to Yoav earlier, one of the things I'm really interested in is, I don't think we really understand the ways in which the intoxicated state, the fact that tens of millions of Americans regularly, from the 18th century, the so-called alcoholic republic, all the way through today, desire intoxication, whether it's alcohol, legal opioids, or illegal drugs like heroin and crack and cannabis. And it's kind of an unsung narrative in the experience, at least of the United States. And it's still a really kind of unsung narrative of global history, the ways in which intoxicants figure our history. So one of the things that is really fun to tell undergraduates, at least, is a grim reminder that in the 19th century, there were no drug laws in the United States. You could buy heroin at the corner store. You could buy cocaine all over the place. And the reasons that those drugs become illegal, it strikes me, is part of this story. So, in order to understand crack, I do backtrack and try to allow readers to understand, scholars I think mostly know this, how and why drugs become illegal, or why certain drugs, not tobacco, alcohol, yes and no, opioids, yes and no, amphetamines, barbiturates, yes and no, cannabis, completely no until now when it's mostly yes. I try to give a sense for where crack cocaine fits into that long trajectory of what I call the intoxicated state. But again, most of my book is really focused on the ways in which crack becomes a business that provides a main chance for a lot of poor, especially African-American men, to make their way in the predatory capitalist regime of the 1980s and 1990s. And I think for readers, this is the most entertaining, also fascinating part of the book, which is, I think we tend to have a sense of poor communities in the United States, especially poor African-American communities, as being disorganized, anomic, places of grave alienation, in which there's been a kind of crushing of the human spirit. And, there's a lot of truth to that. But what I found so fascinating, especially when I started to do interviews with some of the people who were involved in the crack business, was the kind of entrepreneurial zeal, the talent, the ingenuity, the creativity that existed in these crushed parts of American society. And I think one of the most shocking aspects was the fact that there was a tremendous ability to take relatively few resources and make complex, highly successful, at least in the short term, enterprises out of the selling of an illegal substance. And that's a story of capitalism, I think, that needs underlining, that there is tremendous talent all along the lines in the United States, but the directions it takes is very much figured by the structural opportunities that society has created. In the 1980s and 90s, there was a kind of funhouse mirroring of the ways in which Wall Street and innovative venture capitalists were operating to really refigure the American economy during that period of time that was taking place in inner city ghettos. That same kind of what the economists call animal spirits was so vitally invested in that part of the world. Unfortunately, not unlike what was happening in mainstream capitalism, in the world of crack cocaine, there was a kind of similar process of monopolization and concentration of the industry. Only the difference was because there's no legal contracts, there's no ways to defend patents, there's no way to use the kind of legal tools to operate a business in a cruel, but still not necessarily overtly violent way. The crack business became dominated by the cruelest, hardest men willing to use whatever means were necessary to gain control of larger and larger markets. And I do spend a chapter of the book kind of watching, in this case, these are three of the guys I was most fascinated by, three of the crack kingpins, and watching how they take what was, a very kind of mom and pop business, corner store kind of business in which, a lot of people start with $100, started a little local crack dealership on their corner. Eventually we're making $200, $500, $1,000, sometimes $5,000 a month selling crack, get taken over by these big operators. And that's Kenneth McGriff, the Supreme on the far left. He ran one of the largest crack gangs in New York City. That's Jeff Fort, head of the Peace Stone Nation in Chicago, who became one of the largest drug dealing organizations in the United States. And my favorite, Larry Hoover on the right, who headed up the Gangster Disciples, which became a massive crack ring, eventually making over $100 million a year in Chicago alone. And watching these guys operate was like watching, Ivan Bosky or some of the other great predatory capitalists of the 1980s figure out how to manage a business. Only these guys came up through the streets. And so while on the one hand, I certainly have, no warm feelings towards these kind of guys. These were brutal men. I also think that their stories really are not a funhouse mirror, but almost an exact mirror to what was happening in the mainstream economy in the United States. And telling their story is kind of telling the John D. Rockefeller story or the Andrew Carnegie story or the Bill Gates story of the underground economy. And these are figures of great renown in their own communities who still create all sorts of ambivalent feelings in a lot of neighborhoods, especially poor Black neighborhoods in the United States. Larry Hoover, the guy on the right, who's been in prison for more than 4 decades now, he ran much of his crack ring from prison, still has massive followings in Chicago and is treated as a hero. Some of you who are really close followers of the US news might know that Kanye West, the performer, when he had his meeting with Donald Trump in the White House, spent a good deal of his time trying to get Donald Trump to pardon Larry Hoover and release him from prison. So there's Kanye West, this great celebrity, talking to the President of the United States, that Larry Hoover is an entrepreneurial genius and a good guy. And if he got out of prison, he could do a lot of good in the Black community in the 21st century. So the ambivalence that these guys created within their brutal regimes is something else I try to get across, and in part to explain, I don't know, the cruelty of capitalism and also the ways in which capitalism's culture feeds itself throughout the American social spectrum. One of the ways this is most obvious, and again, I assume some of you probably know these things, is that hip hop as an art form and the crack business kind of grow up together. And there's a great deal of interrelationship between these two subcultures operating often on the exact same streets in most big cities in the United States. And I spent a chapter kind of trying to think through the cultural meanings of tremendous Black success in a cruel underground economy in the eyes of the organic intellectuals of that community, hip hop artists, and watching them and other Black folk wrestle with this image and the ways in which they often treat it as nation work or work for the community. That is to say, selling crack, even as it's so obvious that crack is devastating the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. I mean, crack is a dangerous drug, make no mistake about it. Those who become addicted to it watch their lives spiral downward. So trying to make sense of that was something else I was really invested in doing in this book. And I think, again, that's the part I've been really interested in watching people respond to. Young people kind of know crack, college-age kids, 20-something kids. They know crack through the words of people like the Notorious B.I.G., Tupac Shakur, and dozens of other hip-hop artists of that era who still are, I don't know, like the Beatles and Rolling Stones of today for today's generation. I do hope that at least even in the introduction of the book, I get across the degree to which I'm not apologizing or sympathetic to the devastations that these crack dealers brought to their communities. And I think there's an interesting debate that goes on in the scholarly community today about the so-called difference between criminality and social banditry. And for those of you who follow the kind of carceral state studies in the United States, the idea that the United States government and elites have organized themselves to create a punitive criminal system aimed at suppressing African-American lives, there's a tendency sometimes to overlook the brutality of those who invest themselves in some of the criminal enterprises that take place in poor communities. And I think one of the hardest things to do as a scholar is to walk a line between understanding the degree to which underground economies are a normative response to suppressed opportunity and not apologizing for that criminality or pretending, which I think sometimes happens in carceral state studies, that criminality is just a kind of social label that has no repercussions beyond its abstract value as an instrument of explaining racism in the United States. The people who were most hurt by crack were poor African Americans. The people who suffered from crack use were overwhelmingly poor African Americans. There was a crack epidemic in poor African American neighborhoods. The amount of homicides associated with crack went up immensely. The amount of foster children created by the crack epidemic in Black communities went up by over 100%. It doubled during this period of time. I mean, crack was a very devastating substance. And one of the things I don't want readers to come away with is thinking that this was a kind of social construction. This was the lived experience of people during that time, and it was a very difficult time. I won't go into it again. It's something we can talk about. One more piece of this puzzle that I think I tried to explain, and it depends on understanding what I just said about the brutal nature of crack in Black communities, is that probably the leading figure in arguing for a more punitive approach to crack was the man on the far left of that slide, who was Charlie Rangel, who was the head of the Black Congressional Caucus who was the congressman from Harlem in New York City, who saw, sorry about that, who saw crack as just devastating his community and worked hand in foot with the Reagan administration to create that very brutal law that did so much. So again, the racial complexity of this issue is something that we might want to talk about. But the results of it were clear. I'm not going to give up this person. There was tremendous incarceration. So when we talk about law and order, when we talk about the carceral state, crack really was an inflection point in that process. And I don't know how you can see the slide. That's the Cook County Jail in Chicago. Again, I did a kind of case study within the text about Chicago and the ways in which crack both affected the Black community and what people did about it. Over 90% of those young men that you can see in that slide are African American. And Chicago at that point was about 35% Black. So it gives you a sense for the ways in which the crack epidemic really intensified the incarceration of African Americans at this time. I don't want to talk too long, so hopefully I've started to raise some of the questions. One of the last pieces of this that I found so fascinating was trying to figure out why crack blew up so much in the mid-1980s, and then by the mid-1990s, just roughly a decade, 10, 12 years later, crack began to decline in use in poor Black communities in particular. And there's another kind of, within the literature, there's a debate about this. You get a kind of, historiography, scholarship coming out of a more conservative center that argues that incarceration had a devastating impact on the crack trade, that we locked up a lot of major crack dealers, we rolled up huge crack networks, and there's a lot of truth to that, especially in New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles, and that made the supply of crack much harder to get at, and it disappeared. I think today we know that that's overwhelmingly not true, that the degree to which there was a massive incarceration of crack dealers, they simply were replaced. The financial rewards were just too great, and the incentives too appealing to really remove the supply. Second, a lot of people argue that there was a tremendous effort within the Black community to create social services to try to wean people away from crack. So at the demand side, that there was an attempt to kind of help addicts and educate people not to use crack. I think the verdict's still out on that. There's some new work coming out about Los Angeles about that should be telling. I didn't find much evidence of that. I saw interventions as being very local, very small scale, and not terribly successful. What I saw, and here I'm following the Drug Enforcement Agency, so me and the main drug guys are the same on this. What I saw was that young people who came of age in the mid-1990s, in poor Black communities, in poor Hispanic communities in general, looked at what crack had done to their older brothers, their uncles, their cousins, and they saw devastation. They saw that this drug, despite the intense high it provided, despite the euphoria it gave people, despite the kind of sexual charge it allowed, was not worth the price. It was too dangerous and too devastating. And you see young people just turn away from crack. Nancy Reagan, famously in the 1980s, President Reagan's wife, just say no to drugs. What we see a lot of evidence for is a lot of young people saying no to crack. The difference is they didn't say no to drugs. They just turned to other drugs. So angel dust, very potent cannabis, lean, which is a kind of opioid cough syrup drug that was very popular in the South and in Texas and places like that, all kind of upsurged during this period of time. So young people turned away from crack and started picking up other intoxicating drugs during this period of time. And you can sort of follow this in hip hop lyrics as people sort of use other drugs to get that same kind of sensation and high. Crack starts to lose customers, and the economy of crack is transformed somewhere between 1992 and 1998, depending on the city and place. So overarchingly, what my book tries to argue is that the incredible, merciless attack on crack, while not inexplicable, did very little to end the crack epidemic. And that the war on drugs in general, including the war on crack, has really just been a harsh, punitive tool to try to crush an underground economy that's simply like a water balloon or something, just transforms from one form to another, depending on consumer demand and the kind of interceptions that law enforcement can make. So as a business model, crack changes, it reforms, dealers turn to other substances, and the intoxicated state goes on and on and on. And we still haven't figured out how to handle the cultural, economic, and social implications of that intoxicated state. So I hope that gives you something to think about, to talk about. Let's have a chat.
Okay, terrific. So the floor is open, and I don't think we need to adhere to any formalities. People should simply jump in, trusting that the Zoom will make you heard. But I'm gonna start. I'm gonna start also because I'm going to have to exit the conversation early. But I wanted to take advantage and David, ask you give you some kind of ask a question that issues from my reading. And admittedly, I read only the introduction and the conclusion, and it's almost not fair to ask a question based on such a limited exposure to what is a whole study. Nevertheless, I'm going to do it anyway. And I was struck, as you rightly said, by your presentation in the introduction of, I guess, what we could think about as the underbelly of Reaganomics, right? Or another formulation which you suggested just now, which I also liked, is how in fact the poor adjust themselves to this emerging ethnic of entrepreneurialism. Using the few resources that they do, they nevertheless wanted to get in on the action, using and embracing the same sense of the market free, of a market free for all. So and that was utterly convincing, and for me at least quite novel, and a novel way also to think about neoliberal economy, neoliberal economics, which of course is also neoliberal politics and society. But then when I jumped to the conclusion, I lost that thread. And the story that gets picked up after the intervening chapters, after flying over the it's like flying over Kansas, right? We know no one ever stops there. So I land in the conclusion, and there you pick up an interesting. There, in fact, you're focusing on the complications of, I would almost say, the complications of another aspect of neoliberal polity, and that is identity politics and the race question, in which you complicate in interesting and important ways. However, the whole question of poverty and political economy all of a sudden isn't there. So I'm wondering if you could fill that picture in for me, or for us, or you can tell us, explain to us why it's not there. Perhaps it's lost its explanatory power or its relevance to how this epidemic played out.
Yeah. Fair concern and fair criticism that I sort of take two different angles from the beginning to the end. I think if you buy the book, which I heartily recommend, you'll see that I do try to spend a great deal of time in the middle of the text talking about crack as a business. And to some extent, I round out the story in those middle chapters. And one of the things I was most fascinated by, and which I hinted at in the comments I just made, was the degree to which crack money both did and did not affect, we could call it just the straight economy, but also the political economy of poor Black neighborhoods. And it was the hardest part to research, and maybe that's why it drops out a little bit at the end. I started this book with a kind of different question than I ended it with, both literally and as a research project. I started it because I was really interested in where the billions of dollars, and it's billions of dollars, that crack produces went. Like, where did all that money go? And I really hoped that that was going to be the actual book. Like, oh, it went into hip hop recording studios. Oh, it went into hundreds and hundreds of beauty salons and hair weave places. It went into chauffeur services and laundromats. Obviously, that's a really hard story to get at. And what was intriguing was I could often follow where the money went with the guys who got caught. Because like they'd lose their money. It would get captured, and the businesses that they created as front industries would get seized because there's a Forfeiture Asset Act that comes earlier than this time. So both federal and local guys can seize drug assets. So it gets taken out of the Black community. But the guys who are successful, the guys who aren't caught, like, it's really hard to figure out what they did with their money. And so that was a story that I try to get at, and I don't do as good a job as I wish. And I feel like that's a great story that we still don't understand very well. You know, I use somewhere in the text the fake Balzac quote, "Behind every great fortune is a crime." It's like, we know with Jay-Z, the famous hip hop artist, the guy who's a billionaire today, he says straightforwardly, "I raised $900,000 selling crack, and that was my seed capital." So, you know, I have that cute story. There's a lot of stories like that. And some of them I have to say, allegedly this hip hop studio was. So I am really interested in that question. And I start the book, I think it's in that part, right? Yeah. In the very beginning, when I talked to a guy who'd been incarcerated and came out and watched his buddies, he's a good friend of Larry Hoover's, the guy who starts the book out. And he says, Larry, like, he built the nation. Like, that money didn't just disappear. It went into people's pockets. It's what allowed people to live okay lives, not middle-class lives, but okay lives. So yeah, I do that in chapters 2 and 3. I talk about that and try to talk about the political economy of the underground and the ways in which, in some ways, man, for the Black community going back at least in urban America to the 19 teens, that is a fundamental part of the economy. And there's some good sociology on this. But yeah, I let it drop.
All right, but let me follow up. But Reaganomics was also devoted to generating a new Black middle class. Yeah. You almost suggest between the lines that might have also been a result of this, of the illicit, all this illicit capital circulating within the Black community.
Yeah, I don't think.
Is that a fair jump to make?
No, I don't think it's a fair jump to make. So I think the story of Black America is a bifurcated one. And the world that I'm talking about overwhelmingly is brothers on the block. These are people rarely who've gotten through high school. And the worlds in which they operate are among similar people. So these are not people who are getting a toehold into the middle class through selling drugs. It's two different worlds. I think, I've done some work on this. This is still a story I don't think that's very well told. Although you just saw it with Lori Lightfoot, the mayor of Chicago, actually literally talked about this 2 days ago. And what she reminds us is that the administrative state of municipal governments, social workers, teachers, police officers, that's the making of the new Black middle class during the Reagan years. And so it's a public sector Black middle class that's created. And it starts in the 70s and it really escalates in the 80s and 90s. So it's not neoliberalism. The Black middle class is not built on neoliberalism. That failed overarchingly as a project. Black capitalism that Richard Nixon promotes in the late 60s and early 70s does not work very well, and complicated reasons. So no, I'd say we're talking about a bifurcated world.
I'd be interested in hearing more. Sorry, can you hear me? I'm Taylor.
Hey, Taylor.
I'd be interested in hearing more about the relationship between local and state governments and the crack commerce that you were talking about that's kind of not as simple as the like punitive story that we imagine between the federal government and like the new Jim Crow. I just wanted to like hear more about what you meant by that.
Well, there's a wonderful book by James Foreman Jr., maybe some of you know about it, in which he tries, and he's the son of the famous civil rights leader of the same name, and he gives a real good feel for this in Washington, D.C. And he tells a story about being in court and discovering that the judge in front of him is black, the bailiff's black, the mayor's black. And he's working in this almost all black judicial system in Washington, D.C., and yet there's the same kind of punitive nature when it comes to imprisoning young black men, as would be seen in, Reagan's America. And one of the things that I thought was so fascinating was the degree to which you could have a racist judicial system without racism. And we've all been kind of wrestling with that. And boy, what I just said could, probably get me in trouble at my university right now. But I think we're all trying to figure that out, the ways in which all those fancy words, unconscious bias, institutional racism, racism without race, all those kind of pet phrases of scholars right now actually operate. And what I saw was what a lot of criminologists talk about, which is something did happen in poor communities, especially poor black communities, starting in the 1970s, which was, I'd argue, simply from structural concerns. There was economic dislocation. There was a kind of breakdown in opportunity structures, and you started to see a lot more violent crime in poor communities. And black people in particular demanded more policing. They demanded more punitive measures toward predators in their community. And what happened as a result of that was a kind of series of decisions, one after another, that led to an incarceration machine. And it was way easier to lock up black people. And crack is the perfect example of that. And one of the things I thought was so weird was, why are so many crack dealers found guilty and sentenced to prison? And it was the business model, in part, that created the opportunity for this new kind of more punitive state to round them up. Crack gets you high for 15 minutes. Like that, heroin doesn't work like that. Heroin gets you high for a pretty long period of time. So if you're a heroin addict, you usually buy heroin only once every 2 or 3, sometimes only once a week. If you're a crack addict, you buy crack many times a day if you can. Because you can only raise $10, $20 at a time. So crack markets became open drug markets, and they had thousands of sellers because you only needed a small amount of money to buy or sell crack. And it became super easy to round up crack dealers. So local jurisdictions, not the FBI, not the Drug Enforcement Agency, but cops could pick up crack dealers pretty much anytime they wanted. It was just a question of whether they wanted to or not. And so there was something about the drug market, the way in which crack was sold, that enabled at the local level people to say, see, we're doing something about crime. We're meeting the demands of all our constituencies, white people who were fearful, black people who were angry about the destruction of their own neighborhoods. At a local level, crack really enabled an acceleration of the war on crime. So that's one of the things I try to get across, that the ways in which crime markets are organized allow different political opportunities for invested figures to make their political constituents happy. And crack just plays right into
that. David, so I wanted to get back to the question of neoliberalism, but from the opposite angle, because you said that as among these African Americans that you write about in the book, then certainly Reaganomics as a political philosophy was rejected, right? None of them were really becoming Republicans just in terms of voting and political preferences. In terms of economics, obviously Reaganomics is rejected. right? They're still supportive of the welfare state and kind of, welfare reform. I mean, they were against welfare reform, but right, but kind of the Family Support Act of 1987 and things like that. And yet, what I see in your book isn't a failure of neoliberalism. I see the triumph from a cultural perspective of neoliberalism, right? And that, I think, here leads, at least it led me as a reader to understand how powerful it is, exactly because it is able to appeal to African Americans who reject the politics and the economics, and yet the culture, those norms, free enterprise, right? Kind of the myth of the bootstrap that was somehow absorbed or appropriated by many of these drug dealers who kind of wanted to be the Donald Trumps, right? The Gordon Geckos. And in that sense, for me, what was so remarkable, I think, and edifying was the fact that here you see why it triumphs, because those set of values, right, they appeal to them. And I don't know, what do you think about, that sense?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that is what I was trying to argue, that it was remarkable the ways in which you could say structural forces create a kind of cultural frame that's easily adaptable and even desirable among a lot of ambitious young people, even in these very poor neighborhoods. So, it's almost classic Marxism in a normative sense, which is these people are swimming in a sea in which this is the world they understand and recognize and see. I think this is one of those counterfactuals, one of these hypotheticals. If steel industries in East Chicago were still offering union wage jobs that allowed you to be kind of manly and tough, and you could knock back a couple shots after work, but you were making a good wage, a family wage, how many of these guys, corner sellers on the block, would be out there? It's sort of obvious. The answer is very few. Who wouldn't rather be a tough guy with your sleeves cut off, hauling steel and being strong and making a good wage and guaranteed with union protections? And, that's why Black Americans moved, let's say, to Chicago again, to keep staying with the Chicago. I mean, they got those jobs, even union jobs. The steel industry had an integrated union. And that's why I start the book with the guy saying that, oh, these companies have gone crazy. General Motors, Ford, they're not hiring anymore. And yeah, people wanted a family wage. So from the guys who were selling on the corner to the guys who were the kingpins, this was the world that they inherit. They take advantage where they can. They take the most rational opportunities that are in front of them and run with them.
Was this also a way to reestablish a certain sense of African-American masculinity?
Yeah.
In that sense?
That's the other piece that again, if I think, you read more of the book, so you know what I'm talking about. I didn't see this as economic reductionism. I mean, one of the ironies of my story, and this plays more to say New York than it does to Chicago, but in New York, by 1985, there was really low unemployment. There were a lot of jobs available to people, even relatively unschooled people. But they were not traditionally masculine jobs. And so you do see a lot of young men who are like, I don't want that kind of work. And one of the first talks I gave about this was to a primarily Black audience, and it was primarily Black women who were in the audience. It was a social work school, and a lot of social work professors were there. And I started talking about the fact that a lot of these young Black men, one of the things they really hated was taking orders from women. Mm-hmm. And this is not me, man. This is not my research. This is ethnographers at the time. And these Black women, I felt like I was in church. Suddenly they were like, that's right. That's right. They were all all over this. And I thought oh, okay, this is one of these things I was a little anxious about talking about. Mm-hmm. The white Jewish guy coming in and telling them what's what. And they were like, yeah, you got that right. So it isn't just that there weren't good jobs, there weren't good manly jobs. Mm. And so, that's a gendered analysis. That's really important. The whole role of women in this world, I only do some with. It's pretty fascinating.
Right. Yossi,
Yossi, are you trying to say something? It seems that you are, but we're unable to hear you. So while Yossi's struggling with his hardware, David, I'm trying to follow the money.
Okay.
Does any of it, well, so I have two questions, two pretty short, specific questions. First of all, does any of it end up in politics? Whatever you figured out, does any of it end up in politics as contributions to local, again, kind of local government, council persons, mayors, assemblymen, and the such? And I'm also wondering if I'm going to piggyback onto Johan's earlier question, whether this the steady income stream into the community, or it's not necessarily into the community. I understand that a lot of the money actually is, the origin is within the community. But nevertheless, there's a lot of capital and cash circulating. I'm wondering if in one way or another, it picks up some of the Reaganite, Clintonite slack resulting from rolling back welfare programs.
Yeah, to answer the first question about politics, this is, again, one of the more intriguing questions. And again, presents a possible counterfactual. So, Larry Hoover, the guy I described who's the drug kingpin of Chicago, his gang is called the Gangster Disciples, GD. By the early 90s, when he is making so much money, $100 million a year, he changes the designation to Growth and Development, GD, Growth and Development, and creates a political action committee.
Okay.
And asks all his drug dealers to one day drugs money, the revenue from one day of selling drugs has to go to growth and development, which is going to be a political body. And he has a famous picnic, Larry Hoover, in Chicago, where 10,000 of his people mass in a park in Chicago to demonstrate to the city's leadership that he basically has a minimum block of 10,000 voters. And he starts a campaign to start donating, bribing, leading Black politicians in Chicago to do two things. One, to help the community, whatever the hell that means, and also to work to get him out of prison, to parole him. He wants to be a power broker. And he gets the ex-mayor of Chicago, Eddie Sayers, a Black guy, to be his major spokesperson. So yeah, so there is an attempt by Larry Hoover in particular to start to develop political power. And some have argued that the white political elite of Chicago, as a result of this, come down, and there's not much in the book, because there's a lot of hard to substantiate, come down hugely on the Gangster Disciples as a result. Not unlike what had happened almost 20 years earlier in gangland Chicago, when some of the gangs had started to become political in Chicago in the 1960s. So there's a kind of nascent politicization that gets crushed. I did not see that in LA. I did not see that in New York. I don't think we know enough yet to understand what these Black men with a fair amount of cash in their pockets did in a lot of other communities. I think that's one of those under-researched stories.
Is it at all analogous to bootleggers buying politicians in the 20s?
Yeah, exactly analogous. You know, Joe Kennedy.
There you go. Uh-huh.
Yeah. And so I think Larry Hoover, again, you know, who dropped out in the 6th grade of school, he's thinking about all this stuff. And again, one of these stories that I could never get enough to put into a book was supposedly Larry Hoover in prison has at his side a college-educated young man who'd gone through the Black Panthers and was thinking like this all along, and is whispering in Larry Hoover's ears, we can do more than just be gangsters. It's really hard. Every time I got close to a story about Larry Hoover, somebody would turn to me and say, you know, if I tell you more about this story, you know what'll happen to me, right? And I'm like, what about me? And they're like, yeah, you too, dude. So be careful. So it's really hard when you're dealing with criminals to find out some of these cool stories. They're out there.
And what about options of an alternative welfare state?
Yeah.
Criminally funded welfare, community programs.
I think there's no doubt about that. And I think that's still true today. We don't have good ways to measure what the lived experience of poor people is, because so much of their money does come through underground means. And that's been true for decades. It's not just a phenomenon of the neoliberal era of the 80s and 90s. So many families depended on these means for a long time, and still today.
I have a question, if that's okay. Sorry to be kind of participating in this erratically. This is a prime childcare time here in Israel. I was really intrigued by one paragraph in the introduction about the ways in which African Americans at some point just figured out that the price of using crack and dealing in crack was too high. And could you say a little more about that? How did that process evolve? How did it come about? Because human beings don't often understand that the price for something is, too high, at least not in politics. So I'm wondering how that worked on both on an individual level and on a communal level.
So I think it was a social phenomenon. I think people saw so many people who they were close to live lives of desperation when they became habituated or addicted to crack. It was not an abstraction. So in that sense, it was very, very real. It was like living in a family of alcoholics. You're going to have a propensity either to fall prey like them or to rebel against it. And so that's what we see. And this is one of those weird things where we have great numbers. The way it works in the United States is if you get arraigned and have to go to jail, not prison, but before you're even convicted, you have to take a drug test. So we can, through urine samples, see exactly what percentage of people had the alkaloids of cocaine in their blood system over a great period of time. And so we know that you could graph younger people turning away from crack cocaine use as they basically experienced the ravages it was having on their families, their neighbors, people they knew. So that struck me as a pretty compelling piece of evidence.
Hello. Thanks for the talk so far. I wanted to ask if you could speak about the politics of law enforcement and police practices, because my sense is that many of the trends that you talk about have to do with that. You were talking about Harlem, for instance, in New York, and I just keep thinking about Morningside Park. Okay, so you probably know that Morningside Park was the epicenter of drug deals in the 1990s, and today, real estate around the park. And there's just one measure, right? Real estate around the park is soaring, and it's one of the safest places. And in general, so for instance, I'm just one thing that I'm thinking about in terms of police practices is just the fact that in Harlem today, in almost every block, you will have a police car parked, on a random basis, right? So people don't know exactly when it's going to arrive, but policemen and women are there, and the fact that they're there reduces incredibly the likelihood of somebody standing on the street corner and selling drugs. And this was not the case, obviously, in the 1990s. You had cars on the block, but those were cars of dealers who were pushing drugs through the windows. So, and you can think about lots of places where sometimes you get a sense that the state, whether it's the federal government or the local government or the state government, made a decision to change police practices. And that police practices, even with the very specific geographical concentration, right? Geographical focus, right? So you had law enforcement all around Harlem, If you went up to to Columbia University in the 1990s, you probably would not see the other side of Morningside Park. You would not see what you saw down the hill on the Harlem side. So, or everything's Harlem, but you know what I mean, on the east of the park. And that's just one example. You can think about examples from other cities in America. In fact, I think even in a comparative perspective, you can certainly talk about the sense that there is something happens in politics at a certain level of the political machine where enforcement all of a sudden happens, and that changes the map of crime, specifically in your discussion, the map of drug. I was just wondering whether you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, the policing of so-called vice crimes, is a complicated and fascinating subject. And one of the things that's so striking about the policing, particularly of drug crimes, is that really before the early 1970s, very few people went to prison for dealing drugs. It was sort of treated like gambling, prostitution. It was like the police knew about it. Whenever they felt like it, they could arrest somebody. But they chose usually not to, or they chose simply to use street justice if they thought a dealer was too obvious or got complaints from a storekeeper. And what that meant usually is either they just beat him up and took his drugs, maybe his gun too. Maybe they arrested him, but then they didn't even press charges. They didn't follow up. And you start to see changes in policing starting in the 70s, in part because of political pressure. But as you say, I mean, even dealing crack is really fascinating with the ways police approached it. So in New York City, the police arrested almost no one for selling crack in the first few years of the big crack markets. Again, they just treated it as like a social vice. It didn't really interfere with the ways they kept order in neighborhoods. In New York, it's almost too easy to explain. Basically, a drug gang killed a police officer, and the police went crazy. They rolled up huge networks. They just came down like a ton of bricks on the crack dealers, and then they got rewarded for that from the political establishment, and they kept it up. So you're totally right. I mean, this is a story about policing and the pressures on the police to arrest or not arrest, to follow up with charges or not follow up with charges. And that's one of the things I tried to explain a little bit when I got into the more granular aspects of this, which is when we move from a kind of system that policed drug sales, just like, don't be so obvious. We'll beat you up if you sell on the corner. The cops would beat you up. But they didn't really care about arresting and punishing and imprisoning people, to policing drug dealers, where there was a tremendous pressure to like wrap up networks. And they basically just follow the pressure that they receive. Uh-oh, her little voice. The other piece of this, though, that's more complicated is there is a kind of professionalization process going on with policing from the 70s through today. We see how successful that's been given the last few weeks. But there is a change in how policing occurs, and less discretion, more emphasis on scientific policing, on concentrating on crime-ridden neighborhoods using computer technologies to locate crime. I mean, it's a long, complicated story, but your question is on the money and precise.
So if I, on a practical level, what do you think would push, if you wanted to create the kind of political momentum, okay, to limit, drug use or drug-related crime, okay, which as you said, it's a broad range of crime. What would be the most effective? Is it a Rudy Giuliani type of having some kind of somebody at the top who's Rudy Giuliani would make the argument, would take at least some of the credit to what you
Pre-Trump Rudy Giuliani, Udi. Pre-Trump Rudy Giuliani.
Pre-Trump, right? Yeah, the Rudy Giuliani that was where he built his political capital before he started spending it recklessly.
Well, I'll sort
So
of
is it
switch.
that, or is it something? Is it something in the a bottom-up process? Something where the community, because you were talking about things that happen in the Black community, frustration, I think you said, and is it that? I mean, is it a combination of both?
So the easiest way to answer your question is to kind of flip it around. And the basic way to reduce the amount of crime related to drugs is to decriminalize drug behavior. So if you provide heroin addicts with heroin or methadone, you reduce a tremendous amount of crime. So it's harder to simply come down with an iron fist, because then the crime just basically disperses, it moves, it relocates, it reconfigures. I mean, you can put a dent in it that way, and it'll work short term. You can round up a lot of people and put them in jail and then imprison them. But it hasn't worked very well. So, the easiest way is to simply change the terms of what's criminal and what isn't. Then you have massive success. How much cannabis crime is there, in places where cannabis is legal? There's still some, because there's illegal dealers. But man, huge reductions in crime. So, Portugal has done that. Other countries have done this, where they've just redefined what's criminal behavior. That's how it works. That's the best tool. Turn it into a public health crisis instead of a criminal crisis.
But you have hinted beforehand that creating some economic opportunity also makes a difference. So perhaps that's another option.
Say that again.
Perhaps that's to create an economic opportunity for the disadvantaged might also make a difference.
Yeah, on the supply side, obviously, if you can find alternative career paths, that works. I mean, one of the horrible bad decisions that was made in the crack epidemic was basically to round up really small-time guys making $200 a week, not drug kingpins, but just guys on the corner, and throwing them in prison for 1 to 5 years. All that did was harden their criminality. And as you suggest, it would have been so much easier, like, just spend half the money and give them some sort of trade, give them some sort of literacy. Some of these guys were illiterate and innumerate. You probably would have spent the money more wisely and had a better outcome. So yeah, it's hard to, the drug kingpins are in it for the big money, but the drug salesmen at the corner, yeah, they're just looking for a livelihood. And so there's ways to provide alternatives to that.
Maybe I'll jump in with a question, if that's all right. So I thought I might just pick up on one idea that you brought up early in the book, and also I think in your talk as well, about comparing the opioid epidemic and how it's framed as a public health issue versus the crack crisis. And I'm just wondering if you have looked into the history of how the opioid epidemic was framed in the way it now is. When did that framing happen? Who was responsible, etc. And also, was there any relationship between that process of public framing and the crack crisis, or was crack something that was sort of studiously avoided and awkwardly absent from that process of framing the opioid crisis as a public health issue?
There's no simple answer to that. I do think it's fair to say that, in part because of the timing of the opioid crisis, there had been a 20-year learning curve in the United States about the misfortunes attached to a massive punitive turn toward drug addiction and drug selling. So part of it was just economics. I mean, at the state and local level, there's so much money spent now on incarceration that conservatives, as much as liberals, have been vying for alternative solutions to the problem of drug addiction and drug abuse. It's just too expensive to keep locking people up. So that's the irony. So you had both George Soros, the sort of lefty billionaire, and the Koch brothers, the right-wing billionaires, both unifying to create public forums in which we would treat the opioid epidemic not as one more instance in which we can lock up hundreds of thousands of people and imprison them. So there's a kind of, you're right, there's an ideological meeting of minds on this issue. As I say in the book, I think it also is no accident that the opioid epidemic in its origins was primarily white people, and crack was perceived overwhelmingly as black people. So the ability for the American polity to treat marginal people punitively, is for those of us who are historians, that's just normal. So I think that's another piece of it. And thirdly, the opioid epidemic also was a neoliberal phenomenon. So the ways in which opioids became overprescribed and overutilized was also because the Federal Food and Drug Administration, all the other regulatory agencies that are supposed to keep an eye on prescription drugs, had just been decimated from the 80s forward and basically became a kind of revolving door, the FDA, the regulatory agency, a revolving door between bureaucrats and corporate lobbyists. All those factors made the opioid epidemic a part and parcel of the political economy of the neoliberal state. So, it's a whole nother 2-hour discussion to have. But you can see analogs and complete antonyms during this story. You're on mute.
נעשה עכשיו, יוסי. יוסי, אולי תכתוב? אתה רוצה לכתוב באנגלית? יופי, כן, all right, so he'll just write it because he's having some technical issues. So he'll write the question and then I'll just read it out. I wonder, I don't know if I'm anticipating what Yossi's going to write, but maybe could we have you talk a bit about hip hop? Because, I don't know if that came across in the sections that we sent out, but certainly there was a listening, right? You gave, I remember at the beginning of the book, yes, a recommendation, right, for kind of the songs and the hip hop artists that we need to listen to in order to understand this. And I wonder, how influential was crack, both in terms of economic resource and capital, but also in terms of symbolic motivations and so forth, for kind of the emergence of hip hop, right? Because hip hop kind of climaxes in the late 80s, right, with Public Enemy and NWA. How integral is the drug trade and crack epidemic to the rise of hip hop in the late 80s?
Yeah, this was, I don't know, it's terrible to say anything is fun when you're writing about crack, but it was a kind of fun intellectual exercise to watch these young artists wrestle with the meaning of crack. And again, you're talking about people who are right between the ages of like 16 and 25 mostly, both the hip hop artists and a lot of the crack dealers. So, they're really young people. And the expression that hip hop artists often used about crack dealers was flossing. Yoav, you saw that in the book. Flossing, this idea like you could be 18 years old and you could have a gold chain around your neck that was worth $10,000. And you could drive a $60,000 car. And so that was that kind of, again, that kind of, I don't know, gold rush mentality that both hip hop and crack dealing availed to these young men. Like you could go from living on your mom's welfare check to being the king of the neighborhood. And you could be 20 years old. And so there was a kind of exuberance. And so that sense that white America had precluded your opportunities so narrowly, that there were so few chances to demonstrate your talent and your heart and your grit, that's what they focused on. Not the devastation that crack created among their cousins and their auntie and their friends, but this brilliant possibility of making it in America on your own terms. You didn't have to go to college. You didn't have to play the white man's game. you could do it within your own community, in your own neighborhood, and be very, very much a man in doing so. Yeah, I mean, that's so many hip hop songs, just that same story over and over again. And often with a every now and then, a kind of little bird whispering in their ear, but look what you're doing. Tupac Shakur, the famous hip hop artist who dies as a very young man, who's killed playing the game. He has a great rap. It's not one of his more famous ones. I think it's called like Dear Mommy or Dear Mother, something like that. I'm blanking on the exact title. Dear Mom. And he talks about like how proud he is that he can pay his mom's rent. But to do so, he has to sell crack. It is just like, only this tough guy Tupac Shakur could maybe do that rap. So there's ambivalence all along.
I have a question about the hip hop story and about the comparison between the Black community and the white community. To me, one of the most striking features of hip hop is how incredibly popular it is among the white community. To a sense, I think you could easily argue that hip hop is by far the most popular form of music, and maybe certainly music and dance in America. By far, not only that, but it actually became the face of America in the world, right? If you think about, American music today, you see hip hop. You see people doing hip hop all over the world. You see hip hop music in Arabic and in Hebrew and in any language that you could think of, right? So in a sense, this music that, as you describe, and I guess is known, right, steams from the heart of this drug-inflicted community and this crime-infused environment becomes the jewel of American culture. And so, I mean, you talked a lot about the perspective of the Black community. I'm actually interested if you have any insights about the white community or even just the American nation or the American culture as a whole, both from domestically within the United States. How come this is such this is great music. We all enjoy it, right? I mean, is it just that? Is it something, that is just great music, or is there something political beyond that? Okay. And also maybe even how America is perceived now overseas, American culture and American music, right? I mean, hip hop, I think, is much bigger than jazz at the time, right? And so how, both within America and in the way America is perceived around the world. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that.
I think it's part of a long tradition, probably in the United States and most countries of the world, where music that's perceived, rightly or wrongly, as authentic music of people's greatest grievances and their greatest heart, that sense of coming from their soul, has a power to it. And especially at a time in the United States when the music industry had become corporatized and in which there had been fewer and fewer non-manufactured celebrities, hip hop seemed like this paradigm shift. And the fact that it came from the grittiest, hardest, most authentic parts of America, the parts that had been least corporatized, least turned into spectacle, I think gave it its power. And a power that, you're right, it's so weird to watch suburban frat boys mouthing gangsta rap when they live 180 degrees different from that world. It tells something about the power of artistic integrity that comes from authentic experience. And that's why I think rap artists had these massive battles over who was most authentic, because that seemed to give the music its legitimacy in the eyes of listeners. And I think that was something that could be picked up, as you suggest, all over the world, including the global South, where you could get that same sense of music coming from the heart of beleaguered and grieved communities that gave it a kind of authenticity that was hard to compare to anything else. And obviously then it becomes corporatized and celebrated and turned into spectacle and becomes just another part of a capitalist marketplace. But I'm not a music expert, but I do see the phenomenon as part of, what's the saying, how late capitalism works.
David, Yossi wrote his question. Can you see it in the chat? About learned biases, kind of OD?
No, it's not coming up. I've seen other chats for some reason not. Can you just read it to me or
Yeah,
something?
I'll just read it. So he's interested in what effect did the drug overdose of the University of Maryland player Len Bias in 1986 have kind of he was the number 2 pick. He was on his way to go to the Celtics and then he ODs and I recall that is such a transformational moment. I remember as a young guy in New York, I woke up and I heard that on the news and everyone was shocked. So I think Yossi's question is, how much effect did it have on public opinion and on the support immobilized for the war on drugs?
Yeah, I do talk about that in the book, and absolutely it's another one of those inflection points. I think what I found most fascinating was that it really was a dagger in the heart of a lot of Black Americans. You know, it had a greater effect in Black communities, I think, than in white. There already had been a kind of scare, hysteria, panic mongering about crack among white Americans. But for Black Americans in particular, the idea that this 6'7" incredible specimen of a human being could fall prey to cocaine was terrifying. And he did die of a cocaine overdose, not a crack overdose. Powder, he was snorting powder cocaine. But it got conflated in the public's mind. And famously, Jesse Jackson, at that time was the most celebrated African-American civil rights leader, compares selling cocaine to the people who lynched Black Americans in the first third of the 20th century. He compared coke dealers to lynch mobs. So again, it was this reckoning again with Black Americans with this danger from within. You know, and I think, again, one of the things I try to get across the book is like Black Americans were fiercely angry, at least some, about what crack dealers were doing in their own communities. And the Len Bias incident was just, you're right, just a national awakening, but especially in Black communities about the dangers of these new drugs. So yeah, powerful story.
Yeah, guys, any additional questions, thoughts, comments?
I just wanted to jump back to the question about hip hop really fast. I think what you said was really true about the fascination with authenticity, but I was thinking too about the kind of like get rich fast and like have a $10,000 chain necklace fantasy that's kind of being like celebrated in hip hop. And I think like, I mean, as someone who like grew up in white suburbia in California and listened to hip hop and had white girlfriends who loved listening to it too. I mean, I think that like, given the kind of parallel between like the neoliberal American dream and then the way this other economy is functioning, I think it really offers something to everyone, this appeal of like immediate power, you know? And I think for white Americans, it's a way to like enjoy that narrative while it's kind of othered, it's kind of distanced from you. Like it's a way to kind of play with it, I think. Like maybe that's a more skeptical reading of it because certainly there are hip hop songs that are just about the suffering of that phenomena. But I think really a lot of them are about like the rush of power that a lot of people need a way to enjoy without having to really be like, fully associated with it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good insight. I mean, that's the wonder of hip hop. It's not like we all should pick up the gun and sell drugs.
Yeah.
And it's also, I mean, especially for young people, hip hop is incredibly expressive of the pleasures of the body, and sexuality and freedom. And yeah, that transcends race, class, and gender, I think. There was a sense that here were young people who had seized the day. How exactly they seized the day is complicated, and it became a fantasy. But it also was, let's not kid ourselves too, it was also brilliant music.
Absolutely, I love it, yeah.
So, that's a piece of it. Just like rock and roll, I mean, it just transformed a generational consciousness.
Yeah.
It's also about, the heart of what America is all about for many people. It's about money. I mean, and that's, your success is measured in money. It's measured in the car that you drive and in the clothes that you wear. And this is much of what hip hop is all about. I mean, some of the most popular songs are just about that. I mean, the one I think the exception is what you described about Tupac's song about his mom. That's just the exception. It's mostly about his girlfriend or 7 girlfriends.
I agree with you completely. It is kind of reductio ad absurdum of the American dream.
Yeah.
You're 21 years old and you're rich, and look at me, I did it. It's what we're all trained to do in the United States. Those are tough words to end on.
Yeah, well, unless anyone has any other comments or questions, I think this would be a great time to kind of wrap things up. And also, David, this is our final meeting of the year, and obviously it was a very difficult year. We started it in Tel Aviv with a lot of these nice in-person, with nice catering, right? And now here we are via Zoom, but we still have this intellectual community, and I really want to thank everyone here, right? First and foremost for David Farber for giving us his time and knowledge, and also for everyone here, right? The semester's over. This isn't trivial that you took the time and the effort to, on your free evenings to come and talk and keep kind of the conversation going. So really, thanks, David, from all of us. We hope we'll be able to collaborate down the line. And thanks to everyone, right? Stay safe. Have a great summer. And we'll see you soon.
And let me just add, so David, you have an open invitation to physically be with us whenever that becomes possible. And I also want to thank Yoav and Michael Michael for organizing this seminar throughout the year. Okay, this seminar was the heart of the activity of the center in many ways, or at least the intellectual community of the activity. So Yoav and Michael is not here, but still we should mention him. So thanks a lot for that. It's been a really great seminar this year.
All right. Bye everyone.
Bye, everyone. Have a great summer.
Bye.